The silence was deafening. No distress calls, no final transmissions, no heroic last words. Just static where voices should have been. In the depths of the Cold War, as two superpowers raced to conquer the cosmos, whispers began to emerge from behind the Iron Curtain. Stories of men and women who ventured into the void and never returned. Not because they chose to stay, but because they couldn't come back. This isn't about the heroes whose names we know, the ones who got parades and medals. This is about the others, the forgotten, the lost cosmonauts whose existence was erased from history books, their sacrifices buried beneath layers of state secrecy and Cold War paranoia. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling mysteries of the space age. A story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about humanity's first steps into space. What if Yuri Gagarin wasn't really the first? What if he was simply the first to survive the journey? The evidence is scattered, hidden in declassified documents, amateur radio recordings, and the testimonies of those brave enough to speak. Some call it conspiracy theory. Others call it the darkest chapter of space exploration. But the deeper you dig, the more unsettling the truth becomes. From the launch pads of Baikonur to the listening posts of amateur radio operators in Italy, a pattern emerges. Signals from space that shouldn't exist. Voices calling out from the darkness, never to be heard from again. This is the story of the Lost Cosmonauts, and it's more terrifying than any science fiction because it might just be real. The space race wasn't just about national pride or scientific achievement. It was about survival, dominance, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. In this deadly game, some players never made it to the finish line. They became ghosts in the machine, erased from official records, but forever trapped in the collective memory of those who listened to their final moments. October 4th, 1957 changed everything. When Sputnik's beeping signal echoed across the world, it announced more than just Soviet technological superiority. It declared that the heavens were no longer beyond human reach, and with that declaration came an unstoppable hunger for conquest. The United States scrambled to catch up, but the Soviets had already set their sights on something far more ambitious than a simple satellite. They wanted to put a human being in space, and they wanted to do it first. The problem was, nobody knew if a human could actually survive the journey. The radiation, the vacuum, the crushing forces of acceleration and re-entry. Every aspect of spaceflight was a leap into the unknown, and the Soviets were prepared to take that leap with or without certainty of survival. Behind the scenes, a secret program was already underway. The most elite test pilots and military officers were being recruited, trained, and prepared for missions that officially didn't exist. These weren't the cosmonauts whose faces would later grace propaganda posters. These were the expendable ones, the test subjects who would pave the way with their blood and bones. The Soviet space program operated under a veil of secrecy so thick that even today, decades after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we're still uncovering the truth. What we do know is that the path to Gagarin's historic flight was littered with failures, explosions, and disappearances that the world was never meant to discover. In the remote listening stations of Europe, amateur radio operators were picking up something extraordinary. Voices from space, speaking Russian, broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't have existed. Two Italian brothers, Achille and Giovanni Battista Giudica Cordelia, had built sophisticated radio equipment in an abandoned German bunker. They called their operation Torre Bert, and what they captured there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Between 1957 and 1961, these brothers recorded at least 9 separate transmissions that appeared to come from Soviet spacecraft. Not the official missions that made headlines, but something else entirely. Secret flights, experimental launches, human test subjects sent into the void with little hope of return. The recordings were fragmentary, often distorted, but unmistakably human. One transmission seemed to capture the final moments of a female cosmonaut as her spacecraft spiraled out of control. Her voice, calm at first, gradually gave way to panic as she realized her situation was hopeless. Another recording captured what sounded like a man slowly suffocating as his life support systems failed. These weren't the triumphant voices of heroes conquering space. These were the desperate final words of people dying alone in the darkness. The Soviets, of course, denied everything. According to official records, these transmissions were either hoaxes, misidentified satellite signals, or the fevered imaginations of Cold War conspiracy theorists. But the brothers had documentation, technical specifications, and most importantly, they had the recordings themselves. Raw audio evidence of voices crying out from the cosmic void. What made these recordings even more compelling was their timing. Many of the transmissions occurred in the months leading up to Gagarin's flight, suggesting that the Soviets were conducting human spaceflight experiments long before April 12, 1961. If true, it meant that Gagarin's historic achievement was built on a foundation of previous attempts, failed missions where cosmonauts paid the ultimate price for Soviet ambition. The pattern was always the same. A launch would occur in secret, often from remote facilities far from the main Baikonur complex. Radio operators would pick up communications, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Then silence. No recovery missions, no official acknowledgement, no record that the flight had ever happened. The cosmonauts simply vanished, erased from history as completely as if they had never existed. Among the most disturbing recordings was one that seemed to capture a spacecraft tumbling out of control during re-entry. The cosmonaut's voice, distorted by radio interference and growing weaker by the minute, described his instruments failing one by one. His oxygen was running out, his heat shields were compromised, and his communication systems were breaking down. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static and the terrible implication of what had just occurred. But the lost cosmonauts weren't just victims of technical failures. Some disappearances were far more deliberate, the result of calculated risks taken by a space program willing to sacrifice individual lives for national glory. These weren't accidents or equipment malfunctions. They were test flights where the cosmonauts knew they probably wouldn't be coming home. The Soviet space program operated under the principle that space exploration required acceptable losses. Just as test pilots accepted the risks of experimental aircraft, cosmonauts were expected to accept the possibility of death in service to their country. What made this different was the secrecy surrounding these missions. When a test pilot died, there was usually some record, some acknowledgement of their sacrifice. When a cosmonaut disappeared into space, they were simply erased. This systematic erasure of failed missions created a distorted view of Soviet space achievements. The world saw only the successes, the triumphant launches and safe returns. Hidden beneath this facade of technological superiority was a darker reality, one where human lives were expendable resources in the race to conquer space. The evidence for these lost cosmonauts comes from multiple sources, each piece of the puzzle adding weight to the overall picture. Declassified documents reveal the existence of secret training programs and experimental facilities. Eyewitness accounts describe mysterious launches and recovery operations that never appeared in official records. Most compelling of all are the radio transmissions, captured by independent operators who had no political agenda and no reason to fabricate evidence. As we piece together this hidden history, a chilling pattern emerges. The lost cosmonauts weren't isolated incidents or random accidents. They were part of a systematic program of human experimentation, where the boundaries of survival were tested with live subjects who understood they might not survive the experience. What made these disappearances even more haunting was the systematic nature of their cover-up. Soviet officials didn't just deny the existence of failed missions. They actively rewrote history, doctoring photographs and removing names from the official rosters. Cosmonauts, who had once been photographed alongside their colleagues, suddenly vanished from group pictures, their faces airbrushed away as if they had never existed. Vladimir Ilyushin was among the most prominent cases of this deliberate erasure. A highly decorated test pilot and son of aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin, Vladimir possessed all the credentials needed for space exploration. In 1959, he had set a world altitude record, reaching 30,000 meters in his Soviet fighter jet. His skills were undeniable, his loyalty unquestioned, and his political connections impeccable. Yet something went terribly wrong during his secret mission on April 7, 1961, just days before Gagarin's historic flight. According to fragmentary reports that later surfaced, Vladimir's spacecraft suffered a guidance system failure that sent him careening off course. Instead of landing safely in Soviet territory, his capsule came down somewhere in China. The implications were catastrophic. A failed Soviet space mission on foreign soil could have triggered an international incident. What happened next reveals the lengths to which the Soviet space program would go to protect its secrets. Vladimir was allegedly imprisoned by Chinese authorities as a foreign intelligence agent, his very existence becoming a diplomatic liability. For over a year, he remained captive while Soviet officials scrambled to contain the fallout. When he finally returned to the USSR, his space career was over, his achievements buried beneath layers of official silence. The Vladimir Ilyushin case demonstrated how the Soviet space program treated its cosmonauts as expendable assets. When missions succeeded, the participants became heroes. When they failed, the participants were erased. This wasn't just about protecting state secrets. It was about maintaining the illusion of Soviet technological superiority at any cost. But Vladimir was one of the lucky ones. He survived his ordeal and eventually returned home, even if his space career was destroyed in the process. Others weren't so fortunate. They became permanent residents of the cosmic graveyard, their bodies drifting in eternal orbit or scattered across the launch sites of failed missions. The radio evidence collected by the Judica-Cordelia brothers painted an even grimmer picture. Their recording suggested that some cosmonauts were launched knowing their missions were essentially suicide runs. One particularly chilling transmission seemed to capture a female cosmonaut describing her spacecraft's deteriorating condition as she slowly suffocated in the void. Her voice remained remarkably calm even as she reported system failures that made survival impossible. The existence of female cosmonauts in these early secret missions adds another layer to the mystery. Officially, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963. But the radio intercepts suggest that unnamed women were being launched years earlier as part of experimental programs that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. These weren't publicity stunts or propaganda victories. They were scientific experiments with human subjects. The technical quality of the intercepted transmissions provided compelling evidence for their authenticity. The Judica-Cordelia brothers weren't amateur hobbyists. They had constructed sophisticated radio equipment capable of tracking spacecraft communications across multiple frequencies. Their intercepts included technical data, flight parameters, and conversations between cosmonauts and ground control that would have been nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. More disturbing still were the recordings that captured multiple voices from the same spacecraft. These suggested that some secret missions carried crews rather than single pilots, increasing the human cost when things went wrong. One transmission seemed to document the final moments of a multi-person crew as their spacecraft broke apart during re-entry. The voices became increasingly desperate as systems failed and the hull began to breach. The Soviet approach to these failures was ruthlessly pragmatic. Failed missions were classified at the highest levels, their participants sworn to secrecy or simply eliminated from official records. Launch site personnel who witnessed disasters were transferred to remote locations or forced into retirement. Even family members of lost cosmonauts were often told cover stories about training accidents or reassignments to classified programs. This systematic suppression created a parallel history of space exploration, one where human sacrifice was commonplace and acceptable losses were calculated into mission planning. The public saw only the sanitized version, the triumphant launches and successful returns. Hidden beneath this facade was a darker reality, where cosmonauts were treated as test subjects in humanity's most dangerous experiment. The physical evidence supporting these claims extends beyond radio intercepts. Several researchers have documented unexplained explosions at Soviet launch facilities, incidents that resulted in significant casualties but were never officially acknowledged. Witnesses described seeing human remains scattered across launch pads after rocket failures, bodies that were quickly removed and never identified publicly. One particularly horrific incident allegedly occurred in 1960, when a Soviet rocket exploded on the launch pad, killing at least 78 people, including several cosmonauts who were observing the launch. The disaster was so catastrophic that it took months to clean up the debris and recover the bodies. Yet, this incident, which would have been international news if it had occurred in the United States, was completely suppressed by Soviet authorities. The cover-up extended to medical facilities where injured cosmonauts were treated after failed missions. Doctors and nurses who worked with these patients were bound by military secrecy oaths that carried severe penalties for violation. Some medical personnel later reported treating cosmonauts with radiation sickness, severe burns, and other injuries consistent with spacecraft accidents, but they were forbidden from discussing these cases even decades later. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of a space program willing to accept almost any cost in human lives to maintain its competitive edge. The lost cosmonauts weren't just victims of technological limitations or unavoidable accidents. They were casualties of a system that viewed human beings as expendable resources in the pursuit of national prestige and military advantage. The psychological impact on surviving cosmonauts was profound. Those who knew about the secret missions and their tragic outcomes carried a burden of knowledge that couldn't be shared with anyone outside the program. They had witnessed colleagues disappear into space, never to return, seen friends erased from official records, and understood that their own survival was largely a matter of luck rather than skill or preparation. This hidden history casts a shadow over the entire narrative of early space exploration. The triumphant story of human expansion into the cosmos becomes something darker when viewed through the lens of these lost lives. Every successful mission was built on a foundation of previous failures, each victory achieved at a cost that the world was never allowed to know. The weight of these secrets became unbearable for some who witnessed them firsthand. Engineers who had worked on failed missions began to speak in whispers about colleagues who had simply vanished from their posts. Technicians described being ordered to destroy documentation and equipment after catastrophic failures. Even decades later, many refused to go on record, their fear of retribution still too strong to overcome. What made these disappearances even more chilling was the methodical way they were executed. This wasn't chaos or panic. It was calculated erasure performed with surgical precision. Photographs were altered with meticulous care, removing faces and figures as if they had never existed. Personnel files were destroyed or heavily redacted. Even family members were sometimes relocated or given false information about their loved ones' fates. The technology for this systematic cover-up was as advanced as the rockets themselves. Soviet photo manipulation techniques were decades ahead of their time, allowing officials to seamlessly remove evidence of failed missions and lost cosmonauts. Group photographs of training classes would be edited to exclude those who had died in secret missions. Official rosters were rewritten to eliminate names that had become inconvenient. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how this culture of secrecy infected every level of the space program. Junior engineers learned not to ask questions about missing colleagues. Doctors treating injured cosmonauts developed selective blindness about their patients' conditions. Families of the disappeared were taught to accept official explanations without protest. The radio intercepts captured by the Italian brothers revealed another horrifying dimension to these losses. Some transmissions suggested that certain cosmonauts remained conscious and communicating long after their missions had been written off as failures. These weren't quick deaths from explosive decompression or instant incineration. They were slow, agonizing ends where the victims had time to understand their fate and describe it in detail. One recording that particularly haunted the Giudica Cordiglia brothers captured what appeared to be a cosmonaut trapped in a slowly decaying orbit. Over the course of several days, they intercepted fragmentary transmissions as the spacecraft gradually lost altitude. The pilot's voice grew weaker with each contact, describing system failures and dwindling life support while ground control apparently abandoned any rescue attempts. The technical details in these transmissions provided compelling evidence of their authenticity. The cosmonauts used proper radio protocols, referenced specific equipment and procedures, and demonstrated knowledge that would have been nearly impossible for outsiders to fake. Their descriptions of spacecraft systems, orbital mechanics, and life support equipment matched what was known about Soviet space technology of the era. Yet perhaps the most convincing evidence was the emotional authenticity of these final transmissions. The voices, captured by amateur radio operators, weren't delivering scripted performances. They were human beings facing death in the most isolated environment imaginable, and their words carried the weight of genuine terror and desperation. The systematic nature of these cover-ups suggests something even darker than individual tragedies. The Soviet space program appeared to be conducting deliberate experiments in human endurance, pushing cosmonauts beyond known survival limits to gather data for future missions. Some launches may have been designed to fail, with the cosmonauts serving as unwitting test subjects for extreme conditions. This interpretation gains credibility when examined alongside documented Soviet research into high-altitude survival and space medicine. Military medical facilities were conducting brutal experiments on human subjects throughout this period, testing the limits of radiation exposure, pressure changes, and oxygen deprivation. The space program provided an opportunity to extend these experiments into actual spaceflight conditions. The psychological profiles of the lost cosmonauts also fit this pattern. Many were described as highly motivated volunteers who understood the risks but believed their sacrifices would advance human knowledge. They weren't coerced or deceived about the dangers. They were true believers who accepted death as an acceptable price for pushing the boundaries of human exploration. But acceptance doesn't diminish the horror of their fates. The radio intercepts paint vivid pictures of human beings dying alone in the infinite darkness, their final words echoing through space before being absorbed into eternal silence. These weren't heroic deaths in the classical sense. They were clinical observations of human limits being exceeded under laboratory conditions. The impact on Soviet space medicine was profound and lasting. Doctors who treated survivors of failed missions gained unprecedented insights into the effects of space travel on human physiology. This knowledge informed design decisions for later spacecraft and helped establish safety protocols that would save lives in future missions. The lost cosmonauts had become unwilling contributors to a growing database of human space survival data. Ground control recordings, when they occasionally surfaced, revealed the cold professionalism with which these tragedies were handled. Controllers continued to monitor vital signs and collect data, even as cosmonauts reported fatal system failures. The scientific value of the information being gathered apparently outweighed any impulse to attempt rescue or provide comfort to the dying. This clinical approach extended to the families of the lost cosmonauts. Relatives were often told that their loved ones had died in training accidents or been reassigned to classified projects. Some families spent years believing their sons or daughters were alive and working on secret missions, never learning the truth about their fate in space. The few survivors who eventually spoke about these events described a culture where human life was valued primarily for its scientific contribution. Cosmonauts understood that their primary purpose wasn't to return safely, but to generate useful data about human survival in space. Death was considered a valuable outcome if it provided information that would improve future missions. This utilitarian approach to human experimentation reflected broader Soviet attitudes toward individual sacrifice for collective advancement. The space program became a laboratory where human subjects could be tested under conditions impossible to replicate on Earth. The isolation of space made it the perfect environment for observing human behavior under extreme stress. The religious implications of these deaths added another layer of tragedy to the story. Many cosmonauts came from Orthodox Christian backgrounds, where proper burial and remembrance of the dead held deep spiritual significance. To die alone in space, with bodies never recovered or properly honored, violated fundamental beliefs about human dignity and eternal rest. Some families held private memorial services for cosmonauts who had officially never existed. These clandestine gatherings became a form of resistance against the state's erasure of their loved ones. Participants risked severe punishment for acknowledging deaths that had been classified as state secrets. The psychological toll on ground personnel was equally severe. Engineers and technicians who had worked closely with lost cosmonauts struggled with guilt and trauma that couldn't be addressed through normal channels. Mental health support was virtually non-existent for those dealing with classified tragedies. Launch site workers developed informal rituals for remembering their fallen colleagues. These underground memorials served as outlets for grief that couldn't be expressed publicly. Some workers left small tokens or markings at launch pads where cosmonauts had met their fate, creating invisible monuments to the disappeared. The international implications of these losses were carefully managed through diplomatic channels. When evidence of failed missions occasionally surfaced in foreign intelligence reports, Soviet officials deployed sophisticated disinformation campaigns to discredit the sources and muddy the waters of public understanding. Western intelligence agencies were aware that Soviet space achievements came at a terrible human cost, but this knowledge was often kept classified to avoid revealing intelligence capabilities or compromising ongoing operations. The truth about the lost cosmonauts became buried under layers of competing national security interests. Even today, decades after the end of the Cold War, many details about these secret missions remain classified or have been permanently destroyed. The full scope of human sacrifice required to achieve Soviet space supremacy may never be completely known. What survives are fragments, whispers, and the haunting voices captured by amateur radio operators who refuse to let these deaths pass unnoticed. The legacy of the lost cosmonauts extends far beyond their individual tragedies. Their deaths established precedents for acceptable risk in human spaceflight that continue to influence mission planning today. The knowledge gained from their sacrifices, however reluctantly given, contributed to safety improvements that have saved countless lives in subsequent space missions. Yet this utilitarian justification cannot diminish the fundamental horror of what occurred. These were human beings who trusted their government and their mission, only to be abandoned when their usefulness expired. Their stories represent one of the darkest chapters in the history of human space exploration, a reminder that progress often comes at a price that society chooses not to acknowledge. The silence surrounding their deaths speaks to something deeper than simple government secrecy. It reflects humanity's discomfort with the true cost of reaching for the stars. We prefer our space heroes to be triumphant pioneers, not tragic test subjects whose deaths were deemed acceptable losses in the pursuit of cosmic conquest. As we continue to push the boundaries of space exploration today, the voices of the lost cosmonauts serve as a haunting reminder of the human price of reaching beyond our world. Their sacrifice was real, even if their existence was erased. Their deaths mattered, even if their names were forgotten. And their story deserves to be told, even if the full truth may never be known. The cosmic graveyard they inhabit grows larger with each passing year, their bodies joining the debris field of human ambition that now surrounds our planet. They are the silent witnesses to our species' desperate hunger for transcendence, the price we paid for learning that humans could survive in space. They died so that others might live to see the stars, and in their silence they continue to speak to anyone willing to listen. The truth is more complex and more chilling than any simple answer. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, researchers gained access to previously classified archives. What they found wasn't definitive proof of the lost cosmonauts, but it wasn't complete denial either. Instead, they discovered a pattern of incomplete records, missing documentation, and gaps in the official timeline that seemed too convenient to be accidental. James Oberg, an American journalist who spent decades investigating Soviet space disasters, uncovered evidence of multiple catastrophic failures that had been systematically covered up. Launchpad explosions, training accidents, and equipment failures that claimed dozens of lives. While these weren't necessarily the space deaths captured on radio intercepts, they demonstrated the Soviet willingness to hide casualties when it served their interests. The medical evidence proved equally disturbing. Declassified documents revealed that Soviet space medicine researchers were conducting extreme experiments on human subjects throughout the early space program. Altitude chambers, centrifuge tests, and isolation studies pushed volunteers to their breaking points and beyond. Some participants died during these ground-based experiments, their deaths classified as military secrets. What emerged from the archives was a picture of a space program operating under different moral standards than those we might expect today. Human life wasn't sacred when weighed against national prestige and scientific advancement. The lost cosmonauts, whether they died in space or during ground testing, were casualties of a system that viewed their sacrifice as both necessary and acceptable. The radio evidence remains the most compelling piece of the puzzle. Modern analysis of the Giudica Cordiglia recordings has failed to definitively prove or disprove their authenticity. The technical quality is consistent with 1960s Soviet space communications. The voices speak fluent Russian with appropriate technical vocabulary, and the timing correlates with known periods of intense Soviet space activity. Yet skeptics raise valid questions. Why were these Italian brothers the only ones to capture such transmissions? Why didn't other radio operators, including those working for intelligence agencies, report similar intercepts? And why do some of the voices display speech patterns and technical knowledge that seem inconsistent with the known Soviet training procedures? The answer may lie in the nature of the missions themselves. If the Soviets were indeed conducting secret human spaceflight experiments, they would have used different communication protocols, operated on classified frequencies, and maintained radio silence whenever possible. The transmissions captured by amateur operators might represent only the tip of the iceberg, moments when desperate cosmonauts broke protocol in their final extremity. Vladimir Ilyushin's case provides a template for how these cover-ups operated. His disappearance from official records, the conflicting accounts of his fate, and his eventual rehabilitation years later demonstrate the mechanisms by which inconvenient cosmonauts could be erased and restored as political needs dictated. If this could happen to a high-profile pilot with powerful connections, imagine how easily anonymous test subjects could vanish completely. The psychological impact on those who survived these early missions cannot be understated. Cosmonauts like Alexei Leonov, who would later become famous for his spacewalk, reportedly carried the burden of knowing about colleagues who had disappeared into classified programs. Their silence wasn't just professional discretion. It was survival instinct in a system where speaking out could mean joining the disappeared. Modern space agencies have learned from these dark lessons, implementing safety protocols and transparency measures that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Yet the fundamental tension remains between acceptable risk and human life. Every space mission involves calculated gambles with crew safety, and the line between heroic sacrifice and institutional negligence remains uncomfortably thin. The Lost Cosmonauts represent more than historical curiosity. They embody the price of pushing boundaries without adequate safeguards, of treating human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of larger goals. Their voices, whether captured on amateur radio or preserved in classified archives, continue to echo through space and time as a warning about the costs of unchecked ambition. As we prepare for new chapters in human space exploration, missions to Mars and beyond, the ghosts of these early pioneers remind us that progress demands vigilance. Each safety protocol, each redundant system, each careful calculation of risk versus reward carries within it the memory of those who died so we might learn to survive among the stars. The silence of space holds many secrets, but none more haunting than the voices of those who ventured into the void and never returned. They remain out there still, in decaying orbits and scattered debris fields, eternal witnesses to humanity's first faltering steps toward the cosmos. Their sacrifice was real, even if their existence was denied. Their deaths mattered, even if their names were erased. In the end, the Lost Cosmonauts force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of exploration and the value we place on human life when weighed against national ambition. They remind us that behind every triumphant space mission lie countless untold stories of failure, sacrifice, and loss. The stars may be beautiful, but the path to reach them is littered with the bones of those who dared to dream of touching infinity. Whether you believe in the Lost Cosmonauts or dismiss them as Cold War mythology, their story serves a vital purpose. It keeps alive the memory of those who gave everything for humanity's reach toward the heavens, even when that sacrifice was deemed too inconvenient to acknowledge. They are the silent majority of space exploration, the ones who died so that others might live to see tomorrow's dawn breaking over alien worlds. The mystery endures because some truths are too terrible to speak aloud, too classified to confirm, and too important to forget. In the vast emptiness between Earth and stars, their voices still echo, calling out across the decades for recognition, for remembrance, for the simple dignity of being acknowledged as human beings who dared to dream of touching the infinite and paid the ultimate price for that audacity.